Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Charleston Literary Festival. For those of you who don't yet know, I'm Diana Reich, founder and currently Senior Artistic Advisor for the festival. And I'm really delighted to present this session's speakers. Ramie Targoff, furthest from me, talking to Regina Marler. And just waiting for another round of applause, I'd like to express our profound gratitude to the sponsors for this event, Judy and Bernard Cornwell. So, Ramie Targoff is the Yehuda Reinhardt's Professor of the Humanities, Professor of English, and co-chair of Italian Studies at Brandeis University, and she's a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship. Ramie spoke about her previous book, Renaissance Woman, a biography of Vittoria Colonna, the female Italian Renaissance poet, at the second Charleston Literary Festival 7 years ago. Today, Ramie will be talking about her revelatory new book, Shakespeare's Sisters, which takes its cue from Virginia Woolf's famous essay, A Room of One's Own, which suggested that Shakespeare's talented mythical sister would never have had the opportunity to write. So Ramie's book excavates, explores, and celebrates the lives of 4 actual female writers in the Elizabethan and Jacobean period in England, in other words, Shakespeare's era. The book was received with rapturous reviews. Tina Brown described it in the New York Times as a fascinating excavation of 4 intellectual powerhouse women of the 16th and early 17th century. And the Wall Street Journal proclaimed, "These little-known female voices widen our lens onto a past we thought we knew." Ramie will be in conversation with Regina Marler, who writes essays and reviews for the New York Review of Books and elsewhere. She's also a regular Charleston Festival interlocutor. Regina's forthcoming book will focus on her friend Janet Malcolm's collection of collages, which will be a surprise. Regina is also the author of Bloomsbury Pie, The Making of the Bloomsbury Boom, and editor of the Letters of Vanessa Bell, who was actually the sister of Virginia Woolf. So let's see what conclusions Regina and Ramie reach regarding Virginia Woolf's pessimistic attitude concerning the fate of Shakespeare's sisters. I'm going to hand over to Regina and Ramie.
Thank you. Thank you, Diana. Thank you, Charleston, for inviting me back. I love the city. I love to be here. I think you have to explain this title to the audience. Shakespeare's Sisters.
Okay,
Where does it come from?
We'll start there, and
Yeah.
it is a great pleasure to be here, and thanks to everyone who brought me here again. So, when I was studying English literature as an undergraduate at Yale, in my first year of college in 1985 to 1986, I read Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. And this is what many of us read if you take a feminist criticism class or a literary history class. And in A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf told me that if Shakespeare had a sister, and she imagines her as a brilliant woman named Judith, if Shakespeare had a sister with the same talent as he had, what would have happened to her? And she goes on this long apocalyptic rant about how miserable she would have been. She would have been treated like a witch, she would have lived in a hut, she would have been spat upon, she would have died poor, she probably would have taken her own life. This is Virginia Woolf's image of what it meant to be a woman in Shakespeare's England. She says there was no way that someone could have done any writing. And so I read that my first year of college, and I just took her at her word. I thought that that was probably true. And reinforcing that was the fact that in my 4 years of studying English at Yale and in my 6 subsequent years of studying English for a PhD at University of California, Berkeley, I never read a single word written by a woman before Jane Austen. So what happened since then, and it's really extraordinary, and it has to do with feminist scholarship, is that women a generation older than me, and there's almost all women, went into the archives and found a whole bunch of extraordinary writers who didn't go crazy and weren't treated as witches and lived healthy lives and had children and marriages and divorces and complicated things like everyone else, but managed to publish their works and were actually recognized as writers, but they were forgotten. They were forgotten for 350 to 400 years. So Woolf is both right and wrong. Right in the sense that it wasn't easy. There were lots and lots of obstacles. Women weren't allowed to go to school. There were no schools for women. Women couldn't have jobs. Women had almost no legal rights. Women were the property of their husbands, literally under a doctrine called coverture, which meant you were covered by your husband. So there were lots and lots of things women couldn't do, but they were allowed to write, and they did write, and they expressed themselves in extraordinary ways. And so Woolf was actually wrong, because in fact there were all of these women waiting basically to come back up from the archive.
You open the book really beautifully with the funeral procession of Elizabeth I. And I love it because it has a lot of sensory details.
Yes.
And you see the pageantry of the age. And also you get a picture of something enormously important then, which is it's something we don't think about until we watch a coronation or something like that. But the sense of rank, the tremendous importance of rank. And Elizabeth, as you describe in your book, she received a good education, but beyond that, she was enormously gifted. And this isn't the sort of thing that would have happened with every aristocratic household or with everyone. Why educate women at all?
So the only way a woman could get educated in the Renaissance in Italy and in England was if they had parents who cared about their education. And that's true of France too. I just happen to know Italy and England very well because there were no schools. And so it depended on luck, basically. Did your parents think that you as a girl deserved to be educated? Did you show signs of intelligence? It's not a coincidence that several of the women authors in my book were only children. And who knows what would have happened if they'd had brothers. But since there was only one girl there, they decided to educate her and brought in tutors. So there were private tutors for lots of different subjects. For someone like Queen Elizabeth, when she was a princess, her stepmother, so if you think of all the wives of Henry VIII, the last one, Catherine Parr, the one who survived Henry, was a fierce advocate for women's education and was a super well-educated woman herself. And she seems to have overseen Princess Elizabeth's education. And they hired some of the best professors from Oxford and Cambridge to teach her. She was trained in Latin, in Greek, and Latin and Greek were generally not allowed to be taught to women. They were too powerful tools. But it is the case that royalty tended to be educated. It's when you drop down to even aristocratic households, lots of girls weren't educated at all. But the idea that you might possibly have to run the country gave people a little pause. So they would actually make sure that you could read and write. But Queen Elizabeth had a really exceptional education, and she was a pretty formidable intellect. Throughout her entire reign, which was very long, she was writing poems. She was writing meditations. She was translating Boethius and Seneca. I mean, she was a serious intellectual. And I started the book with her funeral because all four of my women were there in different ways. Two of them were actually officially there as part of the aristocrats marching or standing next to their mothers. But also because I think it's interesting to imagine what it would have been like for a young girl to grow up with this queen. This really impressive queen who was publishing some of her work, who was giving super eloquent speeches, to have that kind of a role model and how that might have shaped the intellectual ambitions and aspirations of a couple generations of girls.
Well, three of the four women that you discuss in detail, three out of the four of them are what we would describe as aristocratic to various degrees. And then there's this curious, very very much less likely figure, Amelia Lanier.
Yeah.
She was still connected to the court through her family, but differently. Tell us about her and how you imagine that she came to write.
Yeah. So Amelia Lanier's maiden name is Bassano. It's an Italian name, and it's not just an Italian name, it's an Italian Jewish name. And her father came from Venice with his brothers to play the recorder at the court of Henry VIII. So they were musicians, and they were a recorder, what was called consort, like a little group of musicians. And they all came over from Venice. And they had converted already, but the family in its origins was Jewish. So here we have the daughter of a Jewish Italian immigrant, and her mother was illiterate. She signed her will with an X. So this person went on to become the first woman to write a book of original poetry in the 17th century in England. And that is a kind of extraordinary accomplishment in any case. But the idea that she precisely wasn't raised in a household where she was being taught, she didn't have access probably to books, that's a huge mystery, actually. And you know, I've been listening to Rachel Kushner and to Corinne Troy Bean, and I wish I could make up a great story about this. But as a writer of nonfiction, I can't. So all I can do is put together the pieces that we have left. And in that way, I think writing nonfiction is like being a detective. You go into these sort of little crazy archives. So my richest archive for Amelia Lanier is a really weird and fascinating source, which is that she went to consult an astrologer. And he was sort of like a mix of an astrologer and a therapist, but he was a quack doctor / astrologer named Simon Foreman. And he kept incredibly meticulous notes on all of his patients. So when she went to see him, this was in 1597, he wrote down lots of details about her biography, which presumably she had told him. So it's like when you first see a doctor or a therapist and they ask you about your past and your family and so on. And in that account, she explains that when her father died, when she was 7, she was taken up, she says, by the Countess of Kent. So we understand that to mean, and this was not unheard of, that girls who were either orphans or didn't have access to education were sometimes, in effect, adopted. They were like wards in the household of wealthy aristocratic households, and they might be sort of gentle women servants, or, you know, we're not sure what she was doing there. But when she published this book of poems in 1611, she writes a dedicatory poem to that same woman, the Countess of Kent, and she describes how that woman taught her eloquence, taught her manners, taught her, you know, a number of different things. And so the best guess is that somehow, probably because her father was actually Queen Elizabeth's Italian tutor for a while, because Queen Elizabeth spoke very good Italian and very good French. And there's records of his having given her a beautiful lute for Christmas, of given the Queen. So the Queen seems to have known about Amelia Lanier. The father would have had access to people at court, because although he was just a, you know, middle-class musician, he was in the circle of royalty. So it's probably through those connections that this happened. But as I say, we're reading about it sort of through records accidentally left by, you know, an astrologer. So it's very different when you're working with aristocratic women, which two of the other women are aristocrats. One is what we would call a sort of, you know, bourgeois woman from a wealthy lawyer father. But the aristocratic women in particular, the households kept tremendous records. And, you know, I've gone through the payment records for the household of Mary Sidney, one of the women, and we see how much her Italian tutor was getting and her dance instructor, and how much money was spent on her clothing for a particular season. So, you know, that is all kept in an archive in England where I've spent time, you know, just reading through that. So there's so much more information depending on what class you came from.
Well, that's one of the interesting things about the records that Foreman kept, is that you can also see to her vulnerability as a a woman of a lower class than the aristocrats that she was hanging around with, because he comes on to her.
Yeah, it's a really early instance of sexual harassment. He describes trying to get her to sleep with him, and he says that she wouldn't sleep with him, and therefore she was a whore. So, okay. And interestingly, just while we're talking about Amelia Lanier, the poor woman has had like a long history of being treated badly by men, because the way she came back into the public's attention was actually pretty early. In the 1970s, a British literary historian decided, based on truly the flimsiest of evidence, that she was Shakespeare's dark lady. So for those of you who might remember reading Shakespeare's sonnets, Shakespeare writes 154 sonnets. The first 126 are to a young man whom he's in love with, and he speaks of in glowing terms. The last 27 sonnets are to a woman with dark hair and dark eyes, who's come to be known as Shakespeare's dark lady, whom he disparages. He actually basically, this is the famous poem, "My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun," right? Just he goes through how all of her features are sort of below where he'd like them to be, and yet he wants her, he desires her, and it's a very complicated story. But in the 1970s, as I say, a British historian named A.L. Rouse decided that because Amelia Lanier was Italian and Jewish and wrote poems, she must be like the only person in all of London with dark hair who wrote a poem was Amelia Lanier. And so this was on the front page of the Times of London, that the mystery of Shakespeare's dark lady had finally been revealed. And so that's when she gets republished, actually, under the title Shakespeare's Dark Lady. So even when she came back after 360 something years of being neglected, it was in this incredibly compromised and ridiculous way.
Were scholars taking this seriously?
No, scholars didn't take it seriously.
Exactly. Yeah.
Scholars didn't take it seriously, but it got lots of attention, public attention.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Yeah.
It was an early fake news kind of moment.
Did feminist academics say, "Oh my goodness, here's this"? Did they take her up then at that point?
Well, actually, it was still a couple decades before she got published. In fact, but properly published and edited. It was in the 90s. So it was almost 20 years.
Well, that was a great era. This late 70s through the 90s was a great era of rediscovery of feminist texts and so forth, and editing of materials. There was an interesting issue that arose. I think about publication a lot. We tend, certainly if you're an aspiring writer, publication is this bar, above you, and you're aiming and you're striving, and finally, if you succeed, you get over it. And also, if other people, when they're speaking to the writers, they'll say, "Are you published? You're published." But if we start excluding female achievement from previous centuries on the basis of publication or having failed to publish, a lot of interesting talent drops out of the way, and you get a really warped impression of how many talented women were out there and achieving. That Tate show, Now You See Us, I think it might even still be on. I mean, some people have gone, and it's painting the British Isles, or art in the British Isles, 1520 to 1920, and they face this issue as well, because traditionally when we're looking at artists, the qualification is, do you work professionally? And an enormous number of tremendously talented women have been middle class or above, and they tended not to seek or to desire to make money from their work.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. What's interesting is that the women in this book, with one exception, Anne Clifford, who we'll get back to, actually did publish their works. And so they were in circulation, and there were poems written praising them and so on. So there's this weird time effect of like within 20 or 30 years after their death, they disappeared.
Yeah, absolutely.
So they actually got over that bar, as you say, and yet weren't reprinted. It's the second edition.
Yes.
It's the paperback. It's that thing that comes like later that didn't happen, which is really interesting.
True.
Or they were the works were published, but they were credited to their husbands or their brothers, and that happened a number of times. But there's no way a woman could have translated all of David's Psalms so beautifully. It must have been her brother.
Yeah.
And so they circulated for around 300 years as her brothers. When he was dead, I mean, he died, years before, so there was no way.
He had the bigger name for sure,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
they attached to that. You and I were talking earlier about what makes giving a public presentation like this. These 4 women are very interesting, but one, Mary Sidney, whom you just mentioned, it's little. Her success is a little more expected.
Yes.
She was quite a grand lady. Let's talk about Anne Clifford.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Anne Clifford is, in some ways, she's probably my favorite of the women in this book, because her story is so unexpected and crazy. She was born into the most immense privilege, actually, even more than Mary Sidney. Mary Sidney was born into a sort of impoverished aristocratic household. Anne Clifford's father owned most of the northwest of England. His ancestors came over with the Norman conquerors, and after the Queen, he was the biggest landowner in the kingdom. She was an only child. She'd had 2 brothers who died when they were very little. And therefore, she had every reason to expect to inherit just an immense amount of land and property. And you might be thinking, how could a woman inherit property? Because we've all read Jane Austen and watched Downton Abbey and so forth, and we know that that's not what usually happens because of primogeniture. But it turns out this particular set of estates was so important to the kingdom that the king in the 14th century had passed a specific entail, a specific law that said the Clifford lands need to go to the direct heir regardless of sex. So no bringing in, your second cousin once removed. I mean, it had to be your child if there was a child. So Anne knew that, and Anne grew up with very fancy tutors, with lute lessons and so on. And she expected to inherit, these incredible castles. And this is up near the Lake District, right on the border with Scotland. Anyway, when her father died, she and her mother discovered, to their great disappointment, that he had, at the last minute, or not quite at the last minute, but in the last year or 2 of his life, he had decided to give everything to his brother. He had decided he wanted the name to stick with the Lance, because she wouldn't have been able to keep her last name. And he had given her an enormous dowry, just massive amount of money to compensate her for the fact that she wasn't going to get the land. And she was 13. She decided at that point with her mother not to accept the money and to fight. And she fought for 37 years against all odds. Truly a remarkable, stubborn woman who was, her husband stole their daughter to punish her. She, was treated badly by the Archbishop of Canterbury. She was really put under tremendous pressure, but she refused to give up. And the reason she's in my book, that story is amazing, but I think that what saved her and what kept her going was that she decided to keep a diary. And I don't know how many of you have ever read any of Samuel Pepys, who's the great male diarist of the 17th century. He's famous for describing the Great Fire of London. She is our great female diarist of the 17th century. This woman kept a diary from 1603, before even she was disinherited, 2 years before. She started a memoir with 1603. The very first entry in her diary is Queen Elizabeth's funeral. So she describes being at the funeral and being too small to walk with her mother, who was the Countess of Cumberland, so she had to stand on the side. She describes her mother sitting up with the corpse, with Queen Elizabeth's corpse, because actually the Queen could never be left alone, alive or dead. It didn't matter. You had to serve the Queen. So they had 24-hour rotations of her gentlewomen taking taking care of the corpse. They actually had like full meal service. They would bring in all of her tea, accoutrements, and so forth, and pretended the queen was alive. But so she kept a diary from 1603 until the day before she died in 1676. She lived to 86. And on the day before she died, she could no longer write, so she had her secretary write. Her last entry was, "Thank God I am so well." And then she died. But what's amazing is that she wrote down everything that happened, not just in relation to this lawsuit, but what she was reading, how she felt, what she ate for dinner, who was visiting, what card games she played, what was happening in major events going on in the kingdom. It's all refracted through this diary. And so we get this extraordinary access to her inner life as well as to her public life.
Oh, it's truly incredible. And this strangely comes back to Virginia Woolf, because Vita Sackville West was among those very many aristocratic women who were locked out of what she regarded as her ancestral estate at Knoll. And she never really recovered. The story, as we tell it now, is that in writing Orlando, that her once lover and then friend, Virginia Woolf, had kind of given Knoll back to her. But Vita was very interested in Anne Clifford and edited a portion of the diary, right?
Yeah, they were actually related. So Anne Clifford's first husband was Richard Sackville, who is a distant direct relative of Vita Sackville West. And Anne Clifford's marital home was Knoll House, which is, I don't know if people here have been there, but it's an amazing National Trust property now, which is known as a calendar house, that it has 365 rooms. It's a bit, and 52 staircases and so forth. It maps onto the calendar, and it's not entirely correct, but it's a massive house. What did Virginia Woolf say about it? It was more like a country than a home or
exactly.
something. Yeah, it's just massive. Yeah. But Vita Sackville West actually found Anne Clifford's early diaries. They were in the house in manuscript, and decided to publish them in 1923 in a beautiful little edition with an essay in which she kind of connects to her.
Oh, yes.
Do you want me to read now the passage? Would this be a good moment?
Let's do this, yes. Okay. It'll give you a good flavor of
just for a little bit of Anne Clifford's amazing struggle. So this is a moment in her narrative when there's just more and more pressure on her to give up her lawsuit. Her mother has just died, and her mother was her best friend and her strongest sort of ally, had amassed a great legal team, and they were fighting this fight together. And she had just left the north, one of the castles that her mother had access to as a sort of widow. She was allowed to live in one of the castles, and that's Broome Castle up in Yorkshire. Anne left Broome Castle in early December 1616, riding 29 miles on horseback to Roos, another castle, in southern Westmoreland, where her coach awaited her to bring her to London in time for the Christmas festivities. There, she quickly understood that her legal battle had become a topic of interest at court, involving even King James. Everyone, she wrote, was persuading me to hear and to make an end, since the king had taken the matter in hand. How Anne felt about the constant pestering isn't clear, but she seems at some level to have enjoyed the attention. It was certainly unusual for a woman to find herself at the center of a major legal dispute, and she noted her new status with pride. On December 23rd, she declared, "Now I had a new part to play upon the stage of this world." The drama between King James and Anne began on January 18th, 2 days before a scheduled meeting, when she was invited to the king's drawing chamber, a private gallery next to his bedchamber, for a conversation along with her husband. Anne described kneeling with Richard, that's her husband, before the king, who asked the couple to, quote, put the matter wholly into his hands. Richard quickly agreed. He had no doubt arranged for the meeting in the first place. But Anne refused to budge. As she recounted in her diary, quote, "I beseeched His Majesty to pardon me, for I would never part with Westmoreland while I lived under any condition whatsoever." There probably weren't too many people in the kingdom, male or female, who would have dared to reject the king's offer to take charge of their affairs. But in addition to her own formidable determination, Anne had been buoyed by a private conversation with the Queen. Before seeing James, Anne had visited Anna, this is Queen Anna of Denmark, Anne had visited Anna in her own chambers in the palace, where she also met her friend Elizabeth de Vere, the Countess of Derby. Anne noted that Lady Derby explained to the Queen, quote, "how my business stood, and that I was to go to the king," to which Queen Anna responded, quote, "by warning me to take heed of putting my matters absolutely to the king, lest he should deceive me." Anna and James had long been living separate lives, and it was no secret that they often had competing interests at court. But for the Queen to urge Anne not to trust the king was an extraordinary act of female solidarity, possibly verging on treason. This is the kind of moment Amelia Lanier dreamt of in her preface to Salve Deus, her book of poems, powerful women protecting one another from the hostile acts of men. On Monday, January 20th, Anne arrived at Whitehall after dinner, that's the meal eaten at midday, and spent the first few hours of the afternoon in the private chambers of Lucy Russell, Countess of Bedford, who had her own lodgings at court. Around 8 o'clock, Anne was called to her meeting with James, where she found herself in very different circumstances from 2 days before. The scene that followed is one of the most dramatic in all of Anne's diaries, and I'm going to read, this is all directly from Anne's mouth. "I was sent for up to the king in his drawing chamber, where the door was locked and nobody allowed to stay here by my lord and I, my uncle Cumberland, my cousin Clifford, my lords Arundel, Pembroke, Montgomery, and Sir John Digby. For lawyers, there were my Lord Chief Justice Montague and Hobart Yevelton, the king's solicitor, Sir Randall Crewe, that was to speak for my lord and I. The king asked us all if we would submit to his judgment in this case. My uncle Cumberland, who inherited all the property, my cousin Clifford, his son, and my lord, so all the men, answered they would. But I would never agree to it without Westmoreland, at which the king grew in a great chafe. My lord of Pembroke and the king's solicitor speaking very much against me. At last, when they saw there was no remedy, my lord, fearing the king would do me some public disgrace, desired Sir John Digby would open the door, who snuck me out with him." End of quote. However intimidated she may have been, she was the only woman in that room filled with all of those powerful men, and had stood her ground. Under the doctrine of coverture, Richard had the right to accept the terms of the king's settlement, but he couldn't force Anne either to give her consent or to drop her claims to the land. Since by the traditions of common law, which the king was attempting to override, Anne should have been the legal heir, she had the right to continue her suit. It was for this reason that James bothered to include her in the meetings, and that he found her resistance so infuriating. Anne's diary entry ends with her pronouncing the day a great victory, thanks to both divine and marital support. Quote, "This day, I may say I was led miraculously by God's providence, and next to that, I trust all my good to the worth and nobleness of my Lord's disposition, for neither I nor anybody else thought I should have left over this day so well."
That's great. Thank you. Well, she was an incredibly tenacious woman, maybe a little bit nuts.
I think she was a little crazy. When she got her land, when she finally won the lawsuit, it was just by sheer attrition. All the men in the family had died. So her uncle died, and then her cousin died, and he didn't have any sons. But it was but it was the middle of the Civil War, and she couldn't travel to the north. It was incredibly dangerous. In fact, several of her castles were half ruined. There was intense fighting happening up in Westmoreland. And so to celebrate her victory, she decided the second best thing she could do was to commission a massive painting of herself. It's a triptych, actually, with 3 panels about her life. So if you think about a religious triptych, that was sort of the idea. She has her mother in the center panel pointing at her stomach. And in the back, there's a plaque that says that it was painted to commemorate the day of her conception. So she's dated her conception very precisely. And so she shows her mother pregnant, pointing at her stomach at the moment of her conception. And then on the left of the panel, she shows herself at the age of 15, which is when she was disinherited. And she's standing there wearing a very sumptuous gown. She has a musical instrument, her lute. She has all of her books on shelves that she was reading. And the spines, so one fun fact is that putting the titles of books on their spines happened late in the 17th century. Earlier, the titles were put on the pages. So she has the spines back so that you can read what all her books are. So we've actually assembled a list of her library. We can see all the books she was reading. Anyway, she has herself, so she has her conception, she has herself at the crucial moment of her being disinherited, and then she has herself at the age of 53 when she has regained her inheritance, standing on the other side. And in the very far background, you can barely see them, are portraits of her 2 husbands, but very prominently is her beloved dog jumping up on her. And she had this painted, it's 8 feet by 10 feet, so you can imagine that's a massive size screen. That's how she celebrated. And then a few years later, when the Civil War had died down, she managed to make the trip to the north. This is in 1649, and she never left. She never went back to London in her life. I mean, she lived till 1676. She stayed up there. She started repairing all of her castles, and she did something she called riding the boundaries. She would just travel around all of her properties and stay in them for 3 months at Skipton, and then 5 months in Appleby. And each time she had a formal ritual. She would get the whole, that's why I'm not sure we'd want to go on vacation with this woman, but she was, clearly an egomaniac, but she would have the entire household come out and play music, and they would load up all the carts, and then she would go to the next household. And she called herself the Sheriffess, she gave herself the title, the Sheriffess of Westmoreland. That was a neologism. There was no sheriffess ever before. But she just loved being a landowner. She loved restoring her lands. And then her final writing project, which I think is so significant, is that she decided to write a history of her family. And as I mentioned, her family went back to the Norman conquest. And she had a team of historians and archivists working with her, and she assembled these massive books that are called the Great Books of Record. They're the size of a double folio. So if anyone's seen the Shakespeare First Folio, or think of a big atlas, they're twice that size. And they went through each of the Clifford lords and copied out all the documents, and she wrote a little biography of each person. But it culminated with her. And she wrote a memoir. So we have lots of different self-writing from this woman. We have the diaries, which take us into the weeds of her daily life. Then she wrote, at the end of every year, she would summarize her diary into an annual summary, an annual report, and take the things that were most important.
We've all gotten those Christmas cards.
Exactly. And then she wrote, for this Great Book of Records, she wrote a memoir of the entire life period from her conception until she gained her land, and she called that The Life of Me. And it's appended to this. So these 3 Great Books of Record are massive, as I said. And one of the really deep pleasures for me writing this book was getting to see all of these things, because I spent a lot of time in the archives of each of these women, and this is in Kendall, right at the lowest point of the Lake District in the Kendall County Archive. They have the original manuscripts of the Great Books of Record, of most of the letters that she wrote, that her parents wrote to each other. They have the whole Clifford archive. And just, it's a weird thing. It's hard to explain, but touching the pages, they're manuscripts, they're not printed. So seeing the hand, I was very touched. I noticed that all of the letters she and her mother exchanged had different color ribbons under the seal. So they would seal it, and then she would put yellow or purple or green ribbon. And I took a picture of all of the ribbons. I mean, it was just an amazing thing to see. But she only did that for her mother. So you see weird things that don't get communicated when you read online, for example. Things like the book of Psalms that Mary Sidney, whom we haven't talked about, but Mary Sidney, who's the first woman in the book, as you said, more sort of predictable, aristocratic woman who translated all of the Psalms. When Queen Elizabeth was coming to visit her at Windsor Castle, which is where a lot of The Crown was filmed, that was her house. When she was at her home, excuse me, not Windsor, at Wilton, she had the sort of most talented calligrapher in the kingdom prepare a manuscript of the Psalm translation. So here's the first woman to translate the Psalms into English poetry, and she wanted to present the Queen with her own copy. And this manuscript is so unbelievably beautiful and so precious that when I was working on it at the Bodleian Library, the librarian wouldn't let my husband come look over my shoulder. Like, literally as if like two sets of eyes were too many for this book. I had a watcher. Someone was watching me work on this book. But meanwhile, I was turning the pages of this book, and it's just beautifully written, and it's the Psalms of David, and all of a sudden I thought maybe there were some shadows coming from somewhere. I started to see, or I was hallucinating, I started to see flowers showing up on the page. And I turned the page again, and there were more flowers, and then in the middle of one of the penitential Psalms, Psalm 51, there was an explosion of two roses, it looked like, right in the middle of the poem. And then I discovered that someone had used this book to press flowers. At some point, and I went back through the provenance, and
Victorians.
It's
no
not
respect.
mentioned anywhere in the record. The book had been sold at Sotheby's at some point in the 1900s. No one mentions this. So I have a fantasy of Queen Elizabeth sticking a few flowers in. So we don't know.
Could be good. I'm glad you mentioned the archives, because I always want to know, you have had to flesh out these lives from sometimes very fragmentary materials.
Yeah.
What was the... Tell us something about the greatest mysteries that you were trying to answer in the archives, and what are you most proud of having found?
I think that the most sort of satisfying and weird moment for me was having to do with Amelia Lanier's various lawsuits. So it turns out, I told you all the things women couldn't do. They couldn't have a job, they couldn't vote, they couldn't go to school, but they could sue. They could sue. And my women love suing. Like it just seems to be something they like to do. I mean, maybe it was just a way to exercise your voice. But Amelia Lanier, who we talked about a little bit, had a really tough life. And after she published her book of poems, Salve Deus, in 1611, which I should just say, her book of poems is probably the earliest work of feminist, really, and I mean feminist poetry. This is a book that she wrote for women. She said she only wanted women readers. She wrote a letter to the women of the kingdom. She dedicated it to 9 different women. And the central poem, which has a fancy Latin title, Salve Deus, is a retelling of Christ's crucifixion from the perspective of a woman. And at one point in the poem, she turns over her voice to a very, very minor character in the Bible. So minor that she's only in one of the 4 Gospels, in the Gospel of Matthew, and she doesn't even have a name. This is Pontius Pilate's wife. So Pontius Pilate was the governor of Judea who sent Christ to be crucified. And in Matthew, in the Gospel of Matthew, there's a single line given to this unnamed woman, and she says, "Do not kill that just man, for I've had a dream about him." Amelia Lanier plucks out of obscurity this one woman and gives her hundreds of lines of voice in her poem. And in this long, long speech that Pontius Pilate's unnamed wife gives, she says to her husband, if you kill Jesus Christ, all bets are off. Women should be your equal again. Because what Eve did as an innocent, just fool, deceived woman is nothing compared to what you are about to do in killing our Lord. And she actually says, then let us have our liberty again. That's a direct quote. Let us have our liberty again. And she goes on a long thing about why women have no reason to be subjected to men. And that's like treasonous practically at the period. When you went to church in England for someone's wedding and you heard the homily on matrimony, which was read also just periodically over the year, you were told that women should be three things: chaste, obedient, and silent. That's what women are supposed to be. So to have this woman explode into a long speech on why women should be equal. Anyway, that was her revolutionary book of poems. I think England wasn't ready for it. It was never republished until the 1975 edition. But the next piece of evidence we have about her is that in 1620, so 9 years later, she was a widow, she decided to open a school, which is an amazing thing to do. There were no schools for women. She decided to open a school probably for small children. And she rented some land and a house from a man who then took it away from her. It was familiar themes. He raised the rent beyond her level. And she sued him. And I went into, this was straight out of Dickens for me, in the National Archives in London, up on the top floor. Downstairs things are kind of modern and digitized. Up on the top floor, it's the Chancery Court Archives. And it's really like going into Bleak House Live. And super dusty, really just, it looks like it hadn't been cleaned in decades. And I found where her files were, and I requested her files, and they brought out a box that I would say was this big and very, very heavy. I needed a trolley. And I opened it up, and dust came out on my face. I mean, 17th century dust just went like all over the place. And it turned out that it was just all of the tiny, irrelevant trials. Chancery Court was not criminal. It was like where you went when you didn't have anywhere else to go. And I found her court records, and I read them. And so it was, just this extraordinary thing to hear her voice coming again, though, through the scribe at the Chancery Court. Yeah. But still, it was an amazing experience.
It's delicious. It's very immediate. I know what you're talking about. We have reached time for some questions. So I hope that you. There'll be people walking around with microphones, and if you could stand and speak clearly and ask a true question, that would be great.
And there's another hand up here, just so you know afterwards in the purple.
Here and there.
During the courtly poets, were they expected to read their work? Because, of course, before that, in Greece, it was part of it, wasn't it? The oratory of poetry. And I just wondered if you were in Queen Elizabeth's court, if you wrote it, were you expected to read it?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. Reading poetry was not a common practice at court. They would read at home, in private homes. They would do readings. The Elizabethan court and the Jacobean court were much more interested in spectacle, in theater. So they had masques, which are sort of these smaller theatrical events. They had a lot of dance and a lot of music. But reading poetry was not a big practice in the English court. So we don't have evidence of them reading their poems out loud. Thank you for the question.
I just love the premise of this book, coming
Thank
from
you.
Virginia Woolf back to Elizabeth in England. I was wondering, though, I mean, Virginia Woolf's poem, or Tracy,
Her essay?
yes, starts with that a woman needs money and a room of her
That's right.
own. And given the challenges that do face, the literary arts and the arts in general, and women particularly through to today, what did you find in your research and your reflections in writing this that could be applicable to female and other artists and writers?
Today?
Yes,
Or in
yes, with
general?
that, yes.
Well, I mean, that's a huge question, and I would say that lots of things that Virginia Woolf talks about, having some kind of economic freedom, having space to write,
Privacy.
having privacy, have lots of repercussions for many women in the world today and many men in the world today as well. But I was actually, really struck by the burden that these women in my book were under, even if they were the most aristocratic women in the world, of something we haven't talked about, of bearing children and running households. And so, someone we haven't mentioned, Elizabeth Carey, who's the fourth woman, who was the first woman in England to write an original play. She wrote a tragedy called The Tragedy of Miriam. She had 11 children. And, no matter, we mentioned her briefly, her father was a wealthy lawyer, they had some money, but can you imagine trying to write with 11 children? I mean, they weren't all there at the same time, but her daughters wrote her memoir after she died. She had 4 daughters who actually became Catholic nuns. Elizabeth Carey sent them across the continent after she had converted to Catholicism. And they say that her mother would try to hide in her bedroom and read and write while her servants chased her around trying to comb her hair and put on her clothes, and that all she wanted was precisely what Virginia Woolf wanted. So, that as a kind of fundamental instinct. And for women who, have been more in the domestic sphere and more in charge of taking care of the household and more in charge of raising children and bearing children, the money isn't enough, so being an aristocrat is nice, but these women really couldn't get out from under that. So, we could discuss what the equivalent things are today, but I was really struck because I always imagined that in aristocratic households, that women would have the means and the space, but they absolutely didn't.
No, and it makes me think too about Jane Austen, who, although she didn't have children, she was partly responsible for the running of a home, and she had to be given this comfortable, relatively comfortable life because she didn't have any money of her own. She didn't marry, but there was a squeaky door, and somebody said we should repair that, we should oil this, and she said no, because she needed the warning that someone would be coming in, so she could tuck her writing under a pad at her table.
Yeah.
So, okay, I think we have over here.
Dr. Targoff, you've beautifully described the magic and the visceral pleasure of digging into archives. What do you think is the future of archives in the digital age?
It's such an important question, and thank you for asking. I actually feel that the archive has become, some of us had the great opportunity last night to hear, to see the performance of All the Beauty in the World, and just the joy of seeing real paintings as opposed to seeing them digitally reproduced that he managed to conjure up. And I think that the archive is now a kind of sacred space in a way that it wasn't before. In other words, I think that the attention being paid right now in the archives, at least in the UK and in Italy, where I've done lots of archival research in the last decade, I feel that it has actually kind of risen. I hope it has. But in other words, these material things just, cannot be reproduced. There's no way to do it. There's no way to, one of my most thrilling archival moments, not for this book, but for the last book, which I wrote about the first Italian woman ever to be published in Italy, Vittoria Colonna, and she was Michelangelo's best friend. And she gave a gift of her poems to Michelangelo, and 103 sonnets, and Michelangelo treasured them. And he ended up, the manuscript ended up in the hands of the Vatican. Different, long story. But I got to touch this amazing manuscript in the Vatican, again, with lots of security and many permissions. And the pages were unbelievably smooth, like the smoothest paper I've ever felt. And then I was up in Florence in the Michelangelo archive, and I found a letter that he wrote to his nephew, and he says, Vittoria, my dearest Vittoria has given me the most beautiful present of her poems, and on the most beautiful paper. And then I thought, Michelangelo and I both appreciated this, but it really felt like marble to me. I mean, so I thought, did she choose this for her friend, the sculptor? But anyway, the point of that is, when I read the translation of that poem in a modern edition, I can't possibly reproduce any of that. That what Walter Benjamin calls the aura, the sort of original quality of something that gets lost, as Benjamin says, in the age of reproduction, right, of digital reproduction. So I might just be an optimist, but I'm hoping that we can keep the archives sacred, and that we recognize, just the way we realize as teachers how much we lost when we all had to go on Zoom, because we were all worried that they might just decide this is good and we don't need to have long. And we realized that there's nothing like being in person. I think there's nothing like being in the presence of these original materials. It's fabulous.
Do we have another? We do.
Hello, thank
Hi.
you for such a lovely conversation. I really wanted to ask you, who do you think is the Dark Lady? I've been plagued. I've been plagued by this question since I took Shakespeare. I went to Spelman, so our thesis was, maybe she's a black woman, especially since it's, dark lady, black hair, blah, 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 But I'm curious about what you have to say since you've been studying this for so long. Thank you.
So, yeah, it would be great if we could find her. I think the chances of figuring out, I'm sorry to tell you, the biographical identity of the dark woman is probably impossible. And for all we know, Shakespeare made her up. But I think what's interesting, to your point, is that, Shakespeare's attitude in those poems to this woman is so much the antithesis of his adoring relationship to the young man, and who's blonde and perfect in lots of ways. And we have this dark lady who doesn't behave the way he'd like her to and is difficult. And one of my favorite writing exercises I do this in my women's writing in the Renaissance class and in my love poetry class too, is I ask my students to write a couple sonnets from her perspective back to him. What does she sound like, and what does her voice sound like? And so we're not going to find her, but one of the things that I have found really satisfying working on these women is, let's stop looking for the dark lady. Let's stop figuring out who the real women were behind Beatrice or Portia, because we have these amazing women who actually wrote things and had lives and left all these traces. So instead of fetishizing, Shakespeare's imagination, why not listen to them?
Great spot. Great spot to end. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Ramie, and thank you, Regina, for a truly fascinating and enlightening and lively conversation, which we've all really appreciated. I think you've come to the conclusion that Virginia Woolf was mistaken.
Not her fault.
But I think she would have been delighted to hear what you had to say and to receive the knowledge that wasn't at her fingertips at the time. I also want to say, you'll know from this conversation how lively that book is, and how readable it is, and how accessible it is, and how truly enjoyable. And it's wonderful that you brought these four doughty females back to life. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd also like to thank Bernard and Judy Cornwell as well. I know how much... Bernard is a Shakespeare scholar in his own right, for those of you who don't know, and very dedicated to Shakespeare. So now I would like to remind all of you who don't, and tell those of you who may not yet know, that Buxton Books, our official bookseller, will be selling Regina's books, where she will appear at the table.
Ramie's books.
Sorry,
Sorry.
Ramie's books, where Ramie will appear at the table and be willing to sign and personalise them. If you would ideally leave the theatre from the back doors, which will lead you to the bookstall. If you lose your way, somebody will guide you. So thank you once again to Ramie and Regina.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.